complete understanding of what's going on. Tom Horn, you've written extensively about this dark side. Lucifer fell because of great pride. Set off a chain of events that's still rolling down through time today. And let's just start with that and move forward.
Well, absolutely. I mean, that is the record. Some people, of course, who are non-believers ascribe the fall of Lucifer to nothing more than myth. They compare it to stories of Zeus and other great gods, but we are biblical literalists, and we know that this Bible gives us the accurate story, that there was this very powerful watcher who at one time his presence was unparalleled in terms of the cherubim in heaven, was raised up in himself, became bigger in his own mind and heart than he should have been,
right.
And a terrible kind of madness invaded his mind in which he thought he was going to exalt himself above the God himself.
And not only that, he was a serpent, he was a reptile, and that figures very powerfully into what we're going to be talking about. When he fell, then, L.A., a number of things happened that we have recorded in Genesis. He had a program. I think that program's still rolling along today. And what's he trying to do?
I'm working on a new book. It's called The Cosmic Chess Match. And basically, from my perspective, what I see happening all through the millennia, through the ages, there's this, and it's interesting, I'm a little rabbit trail, but the enemy, we know because we read the book of Revelation at the end, the fallen one loses. We know that. And yet, from his perspective, he still thinks he can win. And so there's this move, counter move, all throughout the Old and New Testament, where the Most High God does something which immediately there's a counter move by the fallen one to either negate that or corrupt it or somehow try to triumph over the situation. So this war, this cosmic battle, has been raging for literally millennia, thousands of years, and in my opinion, is about to spill over into our space-time continuum.
Into everyday life.
Correct,
you might
into
say.
everyday life.
Going back to Genesis chapter 6, reading a famous passage of Scripture where it says in verse 3, the Lord said, "My spirit shall not always strive with man." And that's an interesting preface to what follows. Verse 4 says, "There were giants in the earth in those days, and also after that when the sons of God came in unto the daughters of men, and they bare children to them. The same became mighty men which were of old, men of renown." Josephus talks about those men of old and men of renown as being the Greek gods, the heroes of the Greeks. What do you think about that?
Yeah, well, you know, years ago I came across a term called transgenics. Actually, you know what I was doing? I was writing an article on the history of Halloween for one of Oklahoma's, where your ministry is based, one of their largest newspapers. So what I didn't expect was to come across a new scientific term called transgenics, but I did. Didn't even know what the term meant, but I could kind of make out trans, genes. We're somehow here talking about tinkering with the genetic order, and they were specifically talking about animals, blending this kind of an animal with another kind of an animal, and even with human genes. So I became fascinated with this, and what was interesting, Gary, was I set out to try to learn the meaning behind an emerging new field of science. But I couldn't find any peer-reviewed work in the science journals on where they thought this might go. What I kept running into was a much older story, where what it sounded like transgenics had happened once before, where these very powerful, in the Greeks, the gods, the Sumerians, the Egyptians, they all have their version of the story. And of course, biblical and extra-biblical texts also have a version of the story that take us to these watchers, these scientists, angels, if you will, who came down and tinkered with human and animal DNA following this great fall of Lucifer that you started out talking about.
Well, we've talked about the days of Noah, and a prophecy made by our Lord is so blatant to me, now that I've gotten accustomed to it, that I just wanted to read it, because in the Olivet Discourse, where he's talking to his disciples about his return to earth, at the end of the church age, he says in Matthew 24:37, "But as the days of Noah were, so shall also the coming of the Son of Man be." Now, nothing could be clearer to me than that. Jesus is clearly saying that the period before the flood, that is the conditions of that period, will return again. Assuming that we are living in the years just prior to Jesus' return, this must be talking about our world today. Is that really true?
I would say a resounding yes to that. And the reason that scripture, that it'll be like the days of Noah when the Son of Man returns, begs the question, what differentiates the days of the sons of Noah from any other time in history? And in my opinion, it's the presence of these fallen angels descending the earth, like the Genesis 6 passage tells us, having the unthinkable, doing the unthinkable, having sex with the women, and creating this hybrid Nephilim, this fallen angel human hybrid, which is never supposed to have happened. And this is sort of a move by the fallen one, a counter move in another prophecy talking about the bloodline of the Messiah, the seed of the serpent, the seed of the woman, these two seeds going down through history. And what we see is the enemy, the fallen one, trying to somehow take the battle plan away or get an early victory.
I'll just read what you mentioned. It's Genesis 3:15, which a lot of people say is the key prophecy in the whole Bible, where the Lord God says to the couple and to the serpent, and I will put enmity between thee and the woman, between thy seed and her seed. It shall bruise thy head, and thou shalt bruise his heel. Well, that's commonly interpreted as a battle between the serpent and the Messiah, where each one of them will receive a wound. The Messiah to his heel, the serpent to his head. And of course, that head wound is deadly. But here's the thing. Seed is very, very specific in Scripture. When you talk about seed, you're talking about genetics, right?
Yeah, that's exactly right, and it's very important. And in fact, why much of the Levitical law concerned itself with Israel making sure that they kept themselves pure, that their bloodline did not be contaminated with heathen populations or otherwise. And so I think it is reasonable to conclude that what Lynn Marzulli is saying, that the serpent recognized this early forecast, this proto-evangelium, this pre-preaching of the gospel of the coming of Jesus Christ, that it would make sense that he would set about to try to cut that off. How do you stop the coming of this prophesied one? And the way you would do that would be you would try to contaminate that bloodline. Because, frankly, if the bloodline leading to the time of Christ became genetically corrupted, then no Messiah would have been able to be born, and mankind would be damned forever.
And that would be Lucifer's motive,
That's
or
right.
Satan's motive, to try to stop that. Now, L.A. Marzulli has written a number of books with the word Nephilim in the title. And so let's talk about that word. In Genesis chapter 6, there were giants in the earth in those days, and also after that, when the sons of God came into the daughters of men. Giants, translated from the Hebrew Nephilim, which means the fallen ones, as I understand it. Give us your view of the Nephilim. Who are they? What did they do? And are they doing anything today? Are they back?
Well, that's a mouthful.
Well, yeah, it is.
What we have here in the unthinkable union between fallen angels and the women of earth, we've got this hybrid, the Nephilim. In the first incursion, man's DNA had not weakened. In other words, we lived, as according to the biblical records, 900 years, perhaps even longer. There was probably very little disease that we have today. It's a completely different world than before the time of Noah, before the time of the flood. Then we know that man's days are reduced to 120 days.
120 years.
120 years. And so what we see is in the first incursion, and I believe there were two, at least two, the Genesis 6 incursion where the fallen angels come down, we see that these beings, these Nephilim, these giants could have been as tall as 20, 25, perhaps even 30 feet. And when we begin to explore what that looks like, all of a sudden the megalithic structures in antiquity, for instance, the building of the Great Pyramid, the structures in Baalbek, take on a totally different dynamic and begin to become a clearer picture is sort of seen, because these blocks of stone weigh literally thousands of tons, and we have no idea how they were moved. And I know this sounds fantastic, but you get 50, 30-foot giants together, okay, boys, on the count of 3, and they lift this stuff and off they go. The second incursion, I believe, happened when the spies come into the land and we see the Nephilim there. It's a lesser incursion. We get Goliath, let's say, which is 12 to 15 feet, Og of Bashan, 15 feet. So it's not the same, exactly the same, but it's very similar. Once again, the fallen angels having sex with the women, the byproduct, the offspring being this demonic hybrid known as the Nephilim.
But the giants, in the days of, Abraham, apparently they lived there when Abraham came into the land. They lived there later on in the days of Moses, when Moses came in, sent the 12 spies, and 10 came back and said, we're not going in there, those giants are going to kill us. And then later on, David had a conflict with a giant, as everybody knows, David and Goliath. The giants apparently were, A, prolific, and B, they were cursed. They were a cursed people. God had a judgment on the giants. Can we expect to see giants again anytime soon? Are we talking?
Found in the days he was found to be perfect in his generation. If memory serves me correctly, the word is Tamim. I might not be correct about that, but the point is, in Leviticus, it doesn't speak of moral perfection. It was referring to his DNA. His genetic makeup had not yet been contaminated, as evidently the rest of the world had been, through a process of intermarriage and time, down through time, so that in order to preserve the human race, this was an act of redemption. To preserve the human race, God had to send the great fiat of the flood. But the interesting thing then is, as you both have pointed out, not long after the flood, giants are on the earth again. So they have some method for returning. They have a way of coming back. And that makes the story even more interesting because, as Jesus said in Matthew 24, when his closest disciples said, Lord, tell us, what shall be the sign of thy coming and of the end of the age, the aeon, the end of this dispensation, if you want to think of it that way. And he gives them a list of things that are going to happen, but he concludes it by saying, as it was in the days of Noah. Satan could have seed, could have offspring. Does that take us back? I mean, is there, in other words, when Jesus says, as it was in the days of Noah, is this literally not just the spirit of the Nephilim upon the earth? You remember George Hawkins Pember, the famous English theologian?
Oh, yes.
In the 1700s, he wrote his masterpiece, Earth's Earliest Ages.
It's a wonderful book.
It is. And he sets out 7 different categories of things that have to happen to fulfill Matthew 24. And some of them he saw them starting to develop in his day, in the late 1800s. But the final one, here's this magnificent theologian saying that the most fearsome sign, is how he called it, that will herald the return of Christ will be the return upon earth of the Nephilim. He refers to it as this unlawful offspring of angels and women.
Might we call them aliens? I mean, if they came, and by the way, if they came down, so to speak, would they be coming from other worlds or other galaxies, or would they be coming from somewhere else? When the Nephilim first came, they didn't come from other galaxies, as far as I know. They didn't come from other planets, right?
Well, and what we think of aliens now might not be coming from other galaxies or other planets either. And I don't want to dominate the conversation, but this was one of the other things early on. And guys like L.A. Marzulli were a decade ahead of me on this. But my mind finally got wrapped around an issue that what I was seeing in the history of the Watchers, whether it was from Egyptian belief with their gods mingling animals and humans and all that, the gods coming down, mating with women, the story out of the book of Enoch, the story out of the book of Jasher, which I think has one of the most single important ancient verses, because it actually sounds like advanced biotechnology, but that in the course of doing this study, it took me where Lynn has been for a long time. L.A. Marzulli has been for a long time. You've been there, actually, Gary, for a long time. And that was there is a current, contemporary phenomenon that smacks of exactly what was happening in DNA harvesting in the ancient world. And it's recorded not just by theologians, but actually some of the best secular researchers into UFO are coming across the same phenomenon, harvesting.
Now, L.A. has written a trilogy called the Nephilim Trilogy, and you've written a book called Alien Interviews. If you kind of synthesize all that, Tom just said that you kind of pioneered study in this field. We're really bringing Genesis 6 into the modern era, right?
I would certainly, concur with that. Well, what's interesting about that passage in Daniel is it uses the word cleave. They will not cleave. Their seed will not, mingle with men. They will not cleave. And that word cleave is the same word that we get in Genesis in regard to marriage. And what's interesting, and this takes a minute to set up, what we see in the so-called alien abduction scenario, we see, and this is just a thumbnail sketch of it, the women are taken, they're against their will, they're floated through walls, which gets into some sort of another type of manipulating matter in physics in ways that we don't know. They're taken aboard a ship. They're impregnated somehow. They find themselves 2 to 3 months later, they realize that they're pregnant. They're re-abducted. The child, the fetus, is then taken from them. So what we see here is a similarity that harkens back to Genesis, where the fallen angels, and I believe that's what we're looking at here. When we say alien / fallen angel, that, in my opinion, is what we're looking at. And the idea that in Genesis 6 there was marriage, they took whoever they wanted, but they were wives. The word is cleave. There was marriage. Today that doesn't exist. They take the women. There is no marriage ceremony or anything like that. They impregnate them. There's a breeding program. And the breeding program today, in my opinion, is similar to that of Genesis, except they're trying to produce, not giants, they're trying to produce a human being that will look like us, but will be completely demonically enhanced.
Well, the Lord said that the fondest desire of a demon was to be able to incarnate itself into human flesh. And we have several episodes in the New Testament where the Lord casts demons out of people. And essentially, he tells his disciples that the fondest desire of a demon is to be able to incarnate into flesh. So this ties in exactly to what you're saying. In other words, if they can't use humans, they can hybridize another form of flesh and incarnate themselves into that.
And we need to differentiate between fallen angels and Nephilim or demons.
Okay.
In my opinion, fallen angels are fallen angels. They're part of the host of heaven that fell with Lucifer.
Yes, and I agree.
Demons are the disembodied spirits of the Nephilim left over from the flood. And so they have to, in order to manifest in our dimension, they have to be in something, either a person, hence the demoniac, a demonically possessed person, or a demon-possessed person, as we would say in today's vernacular, or perhaps the enemy, the fallen one, has created some sort of a biological interface suit, if you will, where this entity, this demon can interface with this biologically created suit and then manifest in this dimension. Now that sounds really far out, but remember, we're also told that Satan, the fallen one, will come with all signs and lying wonders, that he will deceive the elect if that were possible, that unless those days were shortened, all flesh,
Yeah, and in my opinion, and I'm sure in yours, the way to deceive the elect is to stage the appearance, if you will, of a contingent from outer space, maybe from Alpha Centauri, or
Zeta
Reticuli, or some likely spot where they have come as ambassadors of goodwill. We're here to help you, or as some wag said, we are here to serve you for dinner.
Yeah.
But this brings us then to a series of discussions that you've had. We're now kind of moving into the field we're talking about aliens, maybe quote-unquote space aliens, UFOs. A lot of Christians shy away from that topic.
Certainly they do, but the upside is more and more people are willing to talk about this today, and as it's actually entering into the mainstream. We may talk later on about how in January of just this year, the Royal Academy of Scientists, this is the oldest body, scientific body in the world, 350 years was their anniversary this year, and of all things they could have talked about in terms of advances in science or speculating about various cosmological issues or whatever, they picked astrobiology for their 350th anniversary, asking this giant question, are we alone in the universe? And so it goes directly to the core of this question. Are we alone? Are we being visited? Are we somehow being manipulated? And people should know that what Lynn Marzulli is talking about, among secular researchers, and the best of all of them, Dr. John Mack, Dr. John Keel, J. Allen Hynek, Corso, his book The Day After Roswell, Jacques Vallée, the most respected researchers in the world on this subject, who did research to the point that it could have even been peer-reviewed if there was such a thing of peer-reviewing alien abduction. All of them came to the same conclusion. First of all, that this exactly parallels biblical demonism. It smacks of the historicity of demonic activity. Secondly, that there is the harvesting of what Vallée called living energy, cellular matter, for some purpose, and all of them came to conclude what Mack did, that this had to be for the purpose of an awkward joining, he called it, of two species.
React to them. And that's interesting to me. How do people react? I'm talking about the government. I'm talking about academicians, people who are considered the movers and shakers in society. How are they dealing with this?
Well, I think unless a person has a biblical overview and has an idea and has studied what the Bible tells us about fallen angels, and about demons, and about prophecy concerning those things, and we touched on that, as in the days of Noah, so will be the Son of Man returns. Unless you come from that paradigm, from that worldview, I think a person is lost. And they are certainly certainly open to the deception from these so-called entities. It's been my understanding, and from my study and my research, that these so-called aliens, which I believe are fallen angels, lie and lie habitually. Jacques Vallée calls them messengers of deception, and titled his book that way. So here's a secular man, Jacques Vallée, with all due respect to Mr. Vallée, entitling his book Messengers of Deception. He's not coming from a Christian worldview,
right,
but he realizes that they lie. And let's just go over something here. If a person lies, they are deliberately obfuscating the truth. They are trying to lead a person away from what is truth. So they have to know what the truth is in order to lie. So that means, taking from that bit of information, I can extrapolate that these entities are malevolent, i.e. evil.
Now, going back a few years to, and we've discussed this on our last program, Roswell, we had the quote-unquote alien landing, which is still classified above top secret, and the reaction of our government was to create a group of intelligentsia to deal with what they consider to be a problem. It was a message problem too, because after all, how do you make yourselves appear credible if A, you've got a spaceship landing and crashing with little green guys on it? How do you make yourself credible? How do you keep your credibility before society? Well, they elected to keep this thing top secret. And B, what really transpired between our government and those aliens? And at that point, a secret panel was convened, usually called MJ-12.
Right.
And, under the Eisenhower administration, it was called Project Jehovah. And brilliant people, Einstein, J. Robert Oppenheimer, Edward Teller, others, were taken into this convocation of minds to try to deal with this problem. And among the questions we now know on their agenda was the problem with cattle that showed up mutilated in a way that couldn't have been done by human beings. As far back as 1953, this group of very superior minds threw themselves at this problem of cattle mutilation. And I believe from that day to this, it's still an open question. And here we can talk about something that I suppose Christians don't usually talk about, but we find that literally hundreds, if not thousands, of cattle have been mutilated in an almost sacrificial way, and nobody has ever yet been arrested, if I'm correct on that.
According to my research, the FBI, law enforcement, in the decades that this phenomenon has been going on, continuing, there has not been charges brought against one person. And remember, this is abduction of a person's personal property, trespassing. There's a whole list of offenses that who's ever perpetrating these crimes is committing. And law enforcement now, and I've spoken to people off the record, and they're told by their superiors, don't even go out, don't even just take a report. They just bury the stuff. They know that who's ever doing this, who's ever mutilating the cattle, does so with impunity. They come and go as they please, and no one touches them. And so we're looking at some sort of a intelligence, some sort of phenomena that is beyond anything we know. And of course, I believe it's interdimensional. I believe it reeks of the fallen angels. It is demonic to the nines. It is evil, malevolent. It is satanic.
And the cattle are always found drained of all their blood. Mm-hmm. They are deprived of certain vital organs, and including the tongue, oftentimes the eyeball, and the surgery is, well, supernatural almost. Mm-hmm. I mean, for example, a heart removed out of a chest wall without there being any exit wound, a brain removed from a skull, all kinds of amazing things. And what's going on? It appears to be almost a sacrificial or ritual type of operation.
I would concur. If we move away from that phenomena briefly and look at what supposedly happens in satanic ritual abuse, the work of Russ Dizdar echoes this, and he's certainly written about it. The idea of blood sacrifice. When we go back into antiquity, we see that blood sacrifice is used by all the ancient cultures. Just think of the Aztecs and cutting out the heart of it, and of a live human being, and then showing it to them, and the Mayans. And I mean, we go back through antiquity and we see this blood sacrifice, the idea of blood sacrifice. Fast forward to the cattle mutilations, it's the same type of phenomena that's going on. I believe except it's no longer human beings sacrificing to fallen angels or demons. It's the fallen angels themselves creating this mayhem. Do they get? We know from Scripture that the life is in the blood. We know that. Abel's blood cries out for the offense because of his murder. That being said, is it possible that these entities, in order to manifest, this is just a scenario. I'm not saying this is exactly what happens. Do they draw sustenance from this? Does that blood give them some sort of a life force which enables them then to manifest in our dimension, in our space-time? We don't know. Is it used in part of the breeding program? Abductees talk about being taken into rooms where these hybrids are in jars. I've written about this. And they see these hybrids in all different forms of gestation. Is the blood, because bovine blood is very similar to human blood, is this part and parcel of the abduction phenomena? Does it all link together? The short answer to that, in my opinion, is yes. It does all link together. But it's so beyond the pale that certainly most Christians don't want to get into this. But we hear from 2 Thessalonians that the fallen one, Satan, Lucifer, comes with all signs and lying wonders. In other words, when he finally manifests on this planet, all the stops are pulled out. He's not messing around. He knows his time is short. And it will be, and this is why I think all this is leading up. It's accelerating. It's moving towards this flashpoint.
Now, these cattle mutilations you're talking about have happened pretty much as top secret events for the last 40, 50 years. That is to say, nobody has ever witnessed a mutilation happening until recently.
Right.
And we find that in England, the shepherds of southwestern England are discovering their sheep being abducted, mutilated, deprived of all their blood, dropped back onto the field.
Same deal.
But the modern shepherds have video cameras, and they've actually photographed lights swooping down over their flocks. They've photographed a sheep actually being lifted up, I understand. So they're beginning to make themselves known in a way they have not before. So we know that in the ritual sacrifices of and we don't believe in space aliens, by the way. We believe they're exactly the same characters who used to show up in the Old Testament times under names like Baal and Molech and others. We believe that these aliens then are harvesting blood for their own purposes in almost a ritual way.
Absolutely, it's ritualistic, and that's why I drew the parallel a few minutes ago to satanic ritual abuse. To me, they dovetail, they overlap. The phenomena has so many points of congruence. I think it's alarming. And what is sobering to me is that if it was one or two of these every decade or something, we wouldn't be sitting here talking about it. But it's not. It's hundreds worldwide, and it happens in certain pockets. Certainly in Colorado, New Mexico, out in the Southwest, the phenomena continues to this day. Now in England, but in other parts of the world, cattle mutilations. It's real, it's burgeoning, it's not going away. And what the purpose of what's great about this kind of a show is we're sending out a message to people who are watching this, listening to it, and understanding that the enemy is hard at work, and he's got a plan, and he's exercising that plan. And the supernatural is manifesting in today's world in real time. And we need to wake up and understand what's confronting us. And that's what's great about the discussion that we're having here today.
Yeah, and talking about it sounds like somebody may have struck a deal. As I'm listening to Lynn, who is far more of an expert in this, and you are too, on the cattle mutilations, than I am, and also perhaps could bring up the subject of human mutilations, which have also been found with the same kind of laser-like removal of a particular kind of body parts. Maybe we can talk about that. A Mephistophelian bargain, is that what we're talking about? Because that's exactly part of the record of what the Watchers did the first time. They made a deal. We will trade technology. We will trade secrets from heaven. In exchange, you give us the use of your women and your animals and blood and whatever. And in many of the other cultures, we did a show recently on 2012 talking about the Mayans and how their gods demanded human sacrifice, and that these organs would be removed even while they're alive. They're put on the chakmul, and their heart is cut out while it's still beating. It is an occultic spirit that, of course, has permeated most of ancient pagan culture, but is there a revival of it now? And back to your question, has our government struck some kind of a deal? Did they do it because maybe they felt they were in a position where they had to? That this power is so much more capable of wiping us out unless, and yet here's the interesting thing. There seems to be, if you agree with the idea that there is a Mephistophelian bargain, then what you're saying is human free will is still operating. That these spiritual forces can only go so far, no further, unless we give them permission. That's almost what Hawkins is saying. Right. In his own way, he is saying, don't reach out and invite them to come here. And we know, of course, through spiritual warfare, for instance, even unsaved people are protected by God. They're protected by His prevenient grace, even unsaved people, so that they will have that opportunity of making a decision to come to Him or to reject Him. If they reject Him, they move closer to inviting these supernatural forces into their life. Is that what we've done under the pretense of high technology? That's an astonishing question.
It is an astonishing question. Tom, let's talk a little bit about principalities, powers, rulers of darkness in heavenly places. That's what Paul called them. To what extent, now, have things changed in the last 50 years? I link this whole thing to Israel's statehood. In fact, to the coming of Israel back to the land we had in 1897. the first Zionist Congress. And interestingly, we had a UFO wave in that year. The first big wave of UFO sightings, they were called. 1948, we had another big wave of UFO sightings, Israeli statehood. In 56, during Israel's Great War of the 50s. In 67, the Six-Day War. 73, the Yom Kippur War. Every one of these events in the growth of modern Israel has witnessed an outbreak of UFO activity as though somebody's watching Israel. To me, there are no coincidences. To me, this is something that has happened for a reason, and this, to me, puts these aliens squarely in the camp of the spiritual creatures the Bible talks about, and not in the camp of visitors from other worlds.
And not long ago, you wrote an article for Prophecy in the News magazine. And I can't quote the statement exactly, but you said that it was under the conditions in which God's Holy Spirit, through the church, I assume, is being diminished on earth, and that as that happens, this pressing darkness seems to be pushing through, that black awakening that Dizdar talks about. That, and as a result, we're seeing more and more being reflected in phenomenology that's occurring around us today. And one other question I wanted to ask either of you as experts is that a moment ago, L.A. mentioned that he believed that this was, the reason there's no blood on the ground around, there's no footprints leading to or away from, there's no car tracks driving up. These things just appear. Organs are removed with maybe even more than medical precision.
Yes.
And there's no explanation for it. It smacks of interdimensionality, that something's moving in and out of our reality to accumulate this DNA. And it raised, while you were talking, what I wrote down was, what is Bigfoot? What is the Loch Ness Monster? How can these things have been seen by so many people so many times, but you go into the lakes with sonar equipment, you can't track them down. Once in a while you'll get a giant blip even. You're tracking something, then suddenly it's gone. What are we talking about?
Yeah, we're talking about a multidimensional creation here, and you mentioned it earlier, I think, on our last program, the second heaven. The Bible talks about three heavens, and that second would be a dimension just beyond our sight, and apparently the spirit world is populated with fallen creatures who can duck in and duck out, do their dirty work, and be gone.
Which is why we're told specifically in the Bible not to indulge ourselves in necromancy or familiar spirits, any of that, because what we're doing is we're popping into the second heaven. We don't belong there. We're not equipped. We can't deal in that dimension. But these entities can and do slip into this dimension. And of course, this is what we're looking at, I believe, that these are not extraterrestrials from Zeta Reticuli or Arcturus or wherever. These are fallen angels manifesting once again on the planet, as in the days of Noah, so will be when the Son of Man returns. It's happening in real time right now, and it's burgeoning. It's not, again, if it was one sighting, once a year someplace, we wouldn't be talking about it. But there, for instance, in 1950, the year I was born, there was one sighting in the month of December. Fast forward to 2009, last year, there were well over 350 reported UFO sightings. Those are the ones that were reported in the same month. 350 versus one in a 60-year time frame, 59-year time frame. That's alarming. So the phenomenon is real, burgeoning, and not going away. And by talking about it and getting this information out, people can make up their own minds as to what is behind this. And of course, we all believe here that this is the work of the fallen one.
The fallen ones who came in the days of Noah, and again, going back to the words of Jesus, which I always love to do, Matthew 24:37, but as the days of Noah were, so shall also the coming of the Son of Man be. We should be encouraged to see all this happening, because it tells us where we are in time. It tells us we're close to the coming of the Son of Man.
Amen.
And listen, that excites me. I don't know about you.
Well, and in addition to that, there's also another sign of the days of Noah, and that was that God's mighty men were able to defeat the Geborim mighty men.
That's true.
That God's mighty men were more powerful. That if young David can run out and say, "You come at me with a sword and a shield, but I come at you in the name of the living God, and with a stone can take down an 18-foot tall," or whatever he was, Nephilim. That's also one of the signs of the end times, so that as darkness continues to get bolder and more intrusive, God is lifting up special people in this day and age who will be able to take the sword of the Spirit. It's kind of almost a two-part issue. There is what happened in ancient days. There's what's happening today. In a very general sense, you had a power that came down to the earth, and it seemed to immediately set about trying to build an empire. It had a plan. It had a system, and the goal of this empire was to subjugate all other living species upon the earth. Immediately, these Nephilim, of course, come under judgment from God. That alone, by the way, I think, also attests to the facts about genetic manipulation, because otherwise you have a God who is depicted in the Scripture as forgiving, loving, not willing that any should perish. Even with the Hebrews, made provisions for non-Hebrew blood to be able to come in and to become a proselyte, to be, to get saved in the Old Testament sense. Always made provision, but when it came to the Nephilim, no grace whatsoever. If they were found, they were to be destroyed. They were to be wiped out. They were an aberration upon the earth. And so to me, even that fact says something about this unusual form of life. Now, will the same thing return? In that last show, we were talking about alien abduction. There seems to continue to be some very mysterious process that is at work, and it is harvesting DNA for some purpose.
Well, and the interesting thing today is that the same group of offenders from on high, if you will, they're back, but this time they're wearing a new disguise. They are disguised as sci-fi types. We come here to serve you. We come from another galaxy. We are superior to you. We've had longer to evolve than you have. We can bring you great technology. We can bring you all kinds of peace where you now have just internal conflict. We can bring peace to you. We can do all kinds of things. We can help you keep your planet green. So they're coming as our divine overseers, and actually I think being received that way by some groups.
Being received that way now in ways that are frankly surprising. For instance, how the Vatican has weighed in on this issue in recent years. And we in the last show we just mentioned this official disclosure series, which you're now making available through Prophecy in the News, 20 hours of audio recording. That grew out of this last January when the Royal Academy of Sciences, the oldest scientific body on earth out of the UK, invited members of NASA, the United Nations, the European Space Agency, people who are brilliant thinkers. They call them a dizzying array of intellects, is how the press referred to it, to come and to discuss one subject. Are we alone in the universe? And actually, can we make contact? Well, when the Vatican weighed in on this, my mind goes back to Galileo and people who were persecuted for scientific inquiry.
Yes.
And now all of a sudden we're warming up to this idea that these beings may not only exist, but, Lynn, they might even be morally superior to us.
I would certainly agree with that when they come, we will look at them. It's what I call, in a pen, the coming great deception, the alien gospel. And this alien gospel is that we were your progenitors. We manipulated and created all life genetically on planet Earth. We were responsible for the Earth's earliest civilizations. We genetically manipulated humans. We are the missing link in evolution, as it were. We set up the different religions throughout the globe, and your ancestors worshipped us as gods, and rightfully so. Now, at this critical juncture in human history, we are back to usher in this new age, this age of peace and love and brotherhood. One planet, one people, please.
So, are they coming from outer space?
Well, personally, I don't think they're coming from outer space. They may be coming from a parallel dimension. We live in, well, 4 dimensions. We used to say 3 dimensions. I almost repeated that from my grade school days. And now we know, of course, thanks to Einstein, that time is the 4th dimension and is, of course, both manipulative, able to be manipulated and measured and changed based on our relationship to time. But in any case, scientists now, you've got all these people talking about quantum physics and what they call planes and parallel dimensions and string theory. And some of these are actually measurable, meaning that we're only doing it in terms of theory, but we're actually able to detect that there are dimensions that are around us that we simply can't see right now with our eyes. If we get to this, there is also another part of this. In what we're doing in biotechnology today, part of the transhumanist movement aspires to alter what we are by blending us with animals, which is what the Watchers did. But they also view that as possibly opening new modes of perception. Maybe then we'll be able to see in to these other realms. Like we know even from the Bible, the story of Balaam's donkey. The donkey can see this angel standing in the middle of the road. Balaam can't see this donkey. Nick Bostrom, who is one of the world's leading transhumanists, he's a professor of bioethicist at Oxford University, has written extensively on this in his Transhumanist Values thesis, which he earned his PhD on, how that by blending ourselves with animals, we're going to open new modes of perception because they can see into areas of the light spectrum that are closed to us.
Research has begun in this area. University of Utah is doing the farming of sheep in particular that have been altered slightly to produce human organs, say a human liver, a human heart, for transplantation. All sounds very good until you look at the implications of it. Now, back to the Vatican for a moment. They have their own astronomer. They have their own observatory. And they've been peering into the heavens. They've been listening to all the reports about UFOs, and they have concluded, their astronomer, Gabriel Funes, has said, we believe that at a certain point in the near future, these alien entities are going to reveal themselves to mankind. We should prepare ourselves for this because they will come as saviors, if you will, and he specifically said they may be vastly superior to us even morally because they may not have ever experienced original sin such as we did. Therefore, we should look to them as much above human potential.
Other priests among the Vatican, Corrado Balducci, some years ago, remember, Lynn, how much he was in the news because he said, and he was not repudiated by the Vatican when he said that aliens are already in contact with the earth. They're already communicating with us, and the Vatican, the highest levels of the Vatican, are aware of it. When Father Malachi Martin, remember, was asked by Art Bell, why, Gary, is the Vatican so heavily invested in the study of deep space, talking about that observatory.
Yes.
And he answered, because they know what is approaching us, and that it could be of the utmost importance within the next 10 years. Well, that 10-year time frame elapsed about 24 months ago, and ironically, not just Corrado Balducci, but Guy Cosmonalgo comes out with his Intelligent Life in the Universe, published by a Vatican publishing house, talking about that very soon we may be in contact with our space brothers. They may be outside the sin question, and therefore...
And what's interesting is last week it was several UFOs over the Vatican that were filmed and recorded and posted. Is that just coincidence? I think what's happening, from my perspective, is that we're being set up for the coming great deception. I mean, when we read in the book of Revelation when it talks about in 2 Thessalonians this great one world religious system, it begs the question: how does one get 1.8 billion Muslims, 2.3 billion Christians to somehow change their paradigm, somehow change their worldview? We're looking, in my opinion, of some sort of an incident, something just so off the charts, unprecedented in all of history, is about to happen. And what are we seeing? What are the signs all around us? the burgeoning UFO phenomena. They will come and they will say that we were, I'll reiterate it quickly, but it's basically the alien gospel. I can't say it enough. There are progenitors that created all life on the planet, genetically manipulated human DNA to our present form, were worshipped as gods. Now they're back at this critical juncture in human history. The Vatican, I believe, is setting the stage for the coming great deception. And it's not that it's almost here. I think it's here, which ties into what you were saying. They know, and they're trying to prepare the masses in some way.
Well, let's broaden this discussion just a little bit and just mention one word, and I'm sure that when I do, all of our viewers are going to just jump up and understand exactly what we're talking about. Roswell. Yeah. Roswell. Let me ask the question I always ask about Roswell. These little creatures out here on the ground, assuming this is all true, they're dead. If those are spiritual creatures from the dark side, we might call them demons, can demons die? What's going on here?
Well, this is the second part of that question that we talked a little bit about in the first show and that I mentioned a moment ago. And that was, okay, we know from historical records that what the Watchers wanted to do, they wanted to leave their plane of existence. Jude, Peter both verify that. The story, of course, is told from Enoch, from whom they are quoting. Their motivation certainly could have been altogether or could have included the ambitious goal of cutting off the bloodline of the Messiah, contaminate the earth's population, so you cut off the bloodline of the Messiah, the human race is lost. When I first looked at this story, this ancient story, I could understand their motivation in that sense. But what I couldn't at first understand is why did they need to blend animals with humans? How would blending the DNA of various creatures facilitate their goal of wanting to leave their plane of existence and enter into this reality? Mm-hmm. And one of the ancient texts, it's not a biblical, it's not in the Bible, it's not part of the canon, but it is quoted in two different places of the Old Testament, referred to, is an ancient text called the Book of Jasher. Mm-hmm. And Jasher tells the same story that Enoch does about the fall of the angels. And by the way, for the listening audience, many, many ancient records tell this story. But Jasher 4:18 says something unique, in that it says that after the angels had revealed the secrets of heaven to mankind, that then, this is Jasher 4:18, then men began to teach the blending of animals of one species with another, therewith to provoke the Lord. One species with another. This is literally an ancient record of advanced biotechnology. The crossing over of species barriers.
In all the cultures of the old world, you know, whether it's Etruscan or Greek or Roman or Egyptian, Babylonian, you find what are called chimeras, human-animal combinations like satyrs, you know, the goat's hindquarters and a human being, a centaur, half horse, half man. And virtually all the gods of the Egyptians are human bodies with the heads of animals, like Thoth, the god of intelligence and writing, for example, has a man's body and the head of an ibis. So the artist was trying to express there some idea about what they considered to be gods. We would call these gods what the Old Testament refers to as Nephilim, giants. There were giants in the earth in those days. I think that's what we would call these creatures that the Egyptians were trying to portray, right?
And also afterwards.
And also afterwards.
Yeah. So this idea of mingling the species, which of course is forbidden, and we know that there's that the dividing line between the species. Each two is, the Bible tells us, each in order of its own kind reproducing. But what we see is the enemy, the fallen one, continues to try to advance this all through history. And now it really makes me wonder. I interviewed for the first book of Nephilim. This goes back 15 years ago, basically. I interviewed a guy at Amgen, American Genetics, and I asked him specifically, what kind of stuff are you doing? Now, this is a tech who doesn't have any security clearance. He can tell me what he's doing. He was taking the DNA of a firefly and putting the DNA of a firefly into a frog. Now, this is, again, 12, 15 years ago. And what would happen is the frog would eventually be born and the frog would glow, light up like a firefly. That is off the charts. Now that's back then with not an underground lab. Who knows what they're doing? And occasionally we get reports from underground bases, and these are colorful reports, apocryphal certainly. There's no way to vet them, but we get these stories of superhumans or bizarre-looking creatures. I mean, who knows what they're doing?
Well, in the old days, the fallen angels helped man, gave him little clues as to how to do this. Are they still giving man clues?
Yeah, see, and I think that's what we're seeing paralleled in certain parts of biotechnology today as a repeat of an ancient forbidden science, crossing over species barriers. Even if you did not believe that the creation of human-animal chimeras, which we're doing in thousands of laboratories and we're funding by every major government in the world right now that's advanced enough to do it, even if you did not believe that that was a repeat of what the Watchers did, you would have to see it as an assault on God's creative genius. Absolutely. Why did God put boundaries around the species in order that each one can only reproduce after? What does he know that we don't know? He could be protecting us from literally a biological nightmare, a Pandora's box, a black death.
You said a minute ago the Levitical laws are replete with commands by God not to create species or species other than those he created.
Even to simulate it. If a man shall lie down with a beast, he shall be put to death. Right. They couldn't, in that sense, just have sex and give offspring, but it was even simulating. Even the idea was such a spirit of Antichrist, such a Luciferian concept, that it was forbidden in the law. It couldn't even be simulated. Now, I asked the question a moment ago, though, how would that facilitate? And the short answer is that because God had created everything, only God, one thing the Watchers could not do, they could not speak, bara, and call forth out of nothingness raw atomic nuclear matter and command it to take a specific molecular form that then becomes a tree or a cow or a dog or a fish or a human or whatever. Only God could do that. What the Watchers could do, since they either participated with or observed creation, they could do what our scientists are doing today, and that is they could take the genetic material of one species and another and blend it to create a body. Why I think they did that was because once God had created all life, including humanity, he set it in motion. And he ordered each kind to reproduce after its own kind, meaning that when the sperm of a human meets the ovum of a human, at the first spark of life, the spirit of a human enters into this zygote. It's blocked. It's in order. In other words, it's not just a vacant, empty biological entity into which a spirit can take up residence. He set it in motion. They had to corrupt that. By blending animals with humans, they created a living biological entity that the spirit of a particular animal, or using the term spirit with animals is kind of problematic, but the nature is what I'm talking about. Of a dog wouldn't enter it because it wasn't a dog. Right. The spirit of a human wouldn't enter it for it wasn't a human. Now all of a sudden we have a living biological product into which these things could download themselves. And in a very brief explanation, essentially I came to believe that that's why they did what they did and how it facilitated their ability to leave their plane of existence. What's spooky about that, Len, is then when you open your books and start reading them, and you see how DNA, cattle mutilations, human mutilations, it's not only happening, it has exploded in recent years.
Yeah, it's just like Genesis 3:15 said, the battle is between the seed of the serpent and the seed of the woman, which is a genetic contest, really, for genetic purity, I guess you could say. And rather than being aliens from outer space, as hoped for by the Vatican, we've got aliens from inner space with that specific goal to do anything they can to corrupt the human genome, right?
The first heaven is Earth. The second heaven, which I believe is this other dimension, is where the fallen one resides. And he's able, right now anyway, to access our dimension through portals, which Tom obviously writes about. And at some point we know, again from Scripture, that the fallen will be cast out of the second heaven, and he comes to Earth. And woe to the inhabitants of Earth because the time is short. I think we're ramping up into those days. In my opinion, all the signs are here. I believe that we are on the verge of what I term the Great Deception, the coming Great Deception, which is simply this: that these so-called aliens, which are nothing more than fallen angels, are here to bring us into a new age, sort of accelerate our evolution, our spiritual evolution, and they'll show us who God is. The Bible tells us that there's going to be a one-world religious system, a one-world government. Many people can see the one-world government forming, but they don't know the one-world religious system. Mm-hmm. Well, if you get 3-mile-wide craft over the different cities of the world, and they've got so-called holographic film, and there's of let's say, the crucifixion and Moses parting the Red Sea and other so-called supernatural events, and they are demonically enhanced and have supernatural powers, I believe that 2 Thessalonians talks about this great falling away, apostasy in the Greek. This apostasy happens, yeah. And there's this great falling away where people, look, if you go out and you see a 3-mile-wide craft over a city, it's going to rock your worldview. It's going to change your worldview. It's going to shake your paradigm. What are we going to believe? And that's why we're doing this our priority. So when this stuff happens, we'll know what we're looking at. We'll rebuke first and ask questions later. That this phenomena is ongoing. It's continuing. There is an end game, and it's rushing towards that end game. I believe that the hybrids are being stored mostly in the second heaven, and we touched on that. We touched on that briefly, yes. Perhaps an underground basis. At some point, this hybridization, I believe, has reached its zenith. In other words, there is a human looking modern-day Nephilim, which can pass as a human, but is demonically enhanced. There's a super soldier. They've been working on this literally for decades. There are those in Christianity that don't believe this is happening. Remember, when 2 Thessalonians tells us that Satan comes with all signs and lying wonders, we need to take note in that. We need to understand and not give it sort of a truncated view and not limit him in what he's able to do. And I'm not saying he's greater or more powerful than the Most High God. Obviously he's not. But we can't underestimate him either. He's pulling out all the stops for this. He's worked on it. The mystery of iniquity has worked for, 2,000 years and continues to work. And we're going to see that reach its zenith, reach its conclusion soon with the manifestation of modern-day Nephilim. They will not look like giants. They will pass as one of us, except they will be demonically enhanced.